Hi, everyone. My name is Brenna, and I am BARC's staff attorney and policy coordinator. Um, I've given this training many times since I started work at BARC. This is my first time doing a training over the Zoom. It's a little, different given that I won't be able to read the room or you all as well as I usually can. I want to just talk a little bit of Zoom logistics before we get into this. Courtney Ray, also from BARC, our associate director, is the host of the meeting and going to be monitoring the Q&A. She's also controlling the screen and the slides, so hopefully we'll sync up well, but I'll be letting her know when to change the slides. I think we're not going to do interrupted questions. Like typically I would say, if there's any moment that I'm saying something that you don't understand, please feel free to interrupt. But given this format, I'd request that if you have a clarifying question that you put it in the chat, and then we'll take pauses and check that and answer them just to keep the flow. And then by the end, we'll have more of a time for discussions. See, other just general Zoom things, use your mute mostly so we don't have background noise. It's great to see faces. It really helps me to know that you're out there. So if you want to keep your faces on, that's fine. But if your kids need you, or you need to like leave and go to the bathroom, whatever, turn your screen off. Totally understand. I've been doing it all day. I think those are the only Zoom logistics. So for those of you who are new to BARC, I'll just give a little bit of information about who we are as an organization. One of the main things we love to do is get people in the forest and connect them specifically with Mount Hood National Forest. You can see our mission is to transform Mount Hood National Forest into a place where natural processes prevail, wildlife thrives, and local communities have a social, cultural, and economic investment in its restoration and preservation. We're really located in place, and this place is both the backyard to those of us who live around the mountain. It's also managed by the federal government, and I'm going to get into a lot more about why that is and what that means in this training. This is an old slide. I have a lot of the key projects of BARC that currently we're doing a little bit differently. One of the main things we do is get people in the forest through free monthly hikes and trainings, and we also go and ground truth, go basically field check all proposed timber sales and other extractive projects. We also do proactive restoration projects. We're doing a lot with beaver habitat restoration and reintroduction, and all of that's done a little differently right now. Mostly we're trying to shift our work into virtual work and we're shifting our protocol to see how we can get people out in the field in a way that still feels safe and responsible right now. Along with the field work comes advocacy. That's one of my main roles. I'm BARC's policy coordinator and staff attorney. So one of the things that I do is look at the information that our volunteers collect on the ground, compare that to what the Forest Service says is going on, reading all their documents, and then looking at the laws and saying, are the facts on the ground meeting up with the Forest Service's story, meeting up with the laws? And where there's places of tension is where I do a lot of my advocacy, where the things that aren't in a line with either the facts or the law, and we push to have more ecological management of the forests. And there's a lot of pushing that goes on because there's a lot of forces that are not driven towards more ecological management. So tonight we're going to talk about the history of the land and the history of the politics, why this piece of land, this part of Earth, is now managed by the US federal government, what that means in terms of its management, and how the law, economics, and politics shape the management of it. I also want to spend some time tonight talking a little bit about what's going on right now in terms of Forest Service approach during the coronavirus pandemic, and why their mission critical priorities are what they are. But first I'm going to talk about this land. And where I sit currently is the land of the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and Clackamas Chinook. And given that we are all in different places, each of us right now is sitting on some land that was stolen from a people. And it's important to start by recognizing that. Before this land was managed by the federal government, it was, you can see here on this map, it was Clackamas, Wishram, Wasco, some Malala. For some reason, this map is missing the Malala people. But there was a robust, amazing, thriving, dense culture of indigenous peoples in the area we call Oregon now. And how this land transferred from indigenous use to US government ownership starts a while ago, but it really gets moving in 1850. And 1850 is when Congress passed the Oregon Donation Lands Act. And the purpose of the Donation Lands Act was to encourage European settlement in Oregon. Courtney, if you want to move to the next slide. What happened, this is a painting of Congress in 1850. These guys decided that they would give 320 acres free of charge to every unmarried male citizen of European descent, 18 or older, and 640 acres to married couples. They had to be bona fide white settlers, and if they met those conditions, they would get this free land. Now, there was a hitch. Indigenous people had not yet given up their right to this land. Treaties were not yet signed. So Congress went back and retroactively passed the law that basically exterminated native title from the land and, quote, authorized commissioners to negotiate treaties, extinguishing the title and removing tribes and leaving the whole of the most desirable portion of Oregon open to white settlers. So this was devastating for the tribes in Oregon, and many of them got removed from the land that was most valuable. And that land were the valleys, the Willamette Valley, the Umpqua Valley, the Rogue Valley, all got cleared, and people were moved. In this area, they were moved either to the Grand Ronde Reservation, which is by the Coast Range and was specifically chosen because how little value that land had, or across the mountain over to the east side to Warm Springs. So now we have a situation where the US government has declared its own title over this land, has forcibly removed the tribes, and began the process through the General Land Office of giving the land away to bona fide white settlers. So let's just let that sink in for a sec. I go through this rapidly because there's a lot, but this was a massive moment of genocide in Oregon's history, and the reverberations of that still exist in the way land is held. So when that happened, the General Land Office got to work in giving away land grants, and eventually about 7,500 land patents were issued under this law, and it was primarily for this lower elevation desirable land. And that meant the land that was not claimed by settlers was up in the mountain ranges and still held by the General Land Office. Could you do the next slide, Courtney? And so, yeah, I'm gonna put my pioneers for this. I forgot my pioneers. My ancestors came over on the Oregon Trail, so I both have deep connection to this land and deep regret for their actions. So we had the homesteaders come in droves from about 1850 to 1890. But something started to change in the late 1880s and 1890s when most all of the desirable land had been taken and there were land up in the mountains, and people started to feel the limits of Western expansion. And there was a growing conservation awareness that started developing. A lot of white men who wanted to be out in the wilderness were starting to see that dissipate. And so there was a shift in the General Land Office from just giving the land away as fast as it could to retaining it and considering what it might do with this land that it now has. And the first kind of wave of conservation activity was taken in 1886 by President Grover Cleveland, who suspended homesteading in 10 townships around Crater Lake and northward to Diamond Lake. This was the first withdrawal of public land in Oregon for scenic or forestry purposes. So starting in 1886 and then moving fairly rapidly in the 1890s, there was this shift from land dispossession from the federal government into private hands to land conservation. So now we're getting towards the beginning. Now the Forest Service is starting to be a little like twinkle in the eye of some of the people in Washington, D.C. The first federal forest reserves were created in 1891, which allowed the president to establish forest reserves. This was later referred to as the Creative Act or the Forest Reserve Act. Good. Just a moment. So one of the things that I like to ask people when we're in a room together is if they can think of where the first use of this law in Oregon was, because it's something that's near and dear to all Portlanders' hearts. But since we can't really do that kind of Q&A, I'm going to just let you know that the first use of the law in Oregon was by the city of Portland in 1892. Henry Failing, who was the chair of the Portland Water Commission, asked a forest reserve be created around Bull Run and to protect our municipal watershed, which was a brilliant move on his part. So the Bull Run Forest Reserve was about 140,000 acres. It was established in 1892. And then the entire Cascade Range Forest Reserve was created in 1893. Managed by the General Land Office. Remember, the same office that its first task was to give away thousands of acres of land to settlers was now tasked with holding these forest reserves. The Cascade Forest Reserve was 4.5 million acres and 235 miles in length. It was the largest forest reserve in the nation. And at that point, some of the people in the extractive industry started to freak out, as we all have seen these waves of conservation and then industry pushback and then conservation and then pushback. So there was a big move to dismantle the reserves in 1895, 1896. And unlike now, when we are mostly fighting loggers, the big push was from sheep ranchers. And sheep ranchers, homesteaders, and miners all said, but wait, we want this land for our own personal use, and almost convinced Congress to rescind it. And then a group of conservation delegates from Oregon went all the way to DC in 1896, convinced the Oregon delegation to stay firm and did not let go of that Cascade Forest Reserve. So that is the birth of the National Forest System as we know it today. So in 1905, Congress transferred all forest reserves and their management from the GLO to the newly created Forest Service. Here we go. Federal land managed in Oregon now. And the Forest Service, so this is the reserve that goes down the middle. All of the green here is national forest land, and all of the yellow is BLM, except even as I say that, it doesn't quite have the BLM lands down in Southern Oregon. There's a lot down there. But in 1905, the Forest Service was created and took over those forest reserves. Just in terms of Mount Hood National Forest, the Cascade Forest Reserve started breaking up into smaller management units. The Bull Run Forest Reserve had become the Bull Run National Forest in 1907. And then in 1908, it was combined with the Cascade National Forest to establish the Oregon National Forest, but then that subsequently got broken up into Willamette, Umpqua, Siskiyou, and Mount Hood National Forests in 1924, which is the configuration that we still have today. So it's approaching 100 years of management under the Forest Service as we currently know it. So that's the super rapid land transition from the land being held by indigenous peoples to the land being held and managed by the US Federal Forest Service. And just so I don't leave this thread hanging, you might be like, Brenna, but what about the General Land Office? Anybody? Oh, I can't ask questions. Sorry. General Land Office, it was holding on to all this land that nobody else wanted. And eventually it took that land and it merged with something called the Tailored Grazing Service in the 1930s. And together the GLO and the Grazing Service became the Bureau of Land Management. So one of the reasons some of the BLM's land holdings are so strange is because they're full of land that the GLO had that nobody wanted, and it just stayed in federal government land after the major land theft. Let's talk a little bit about the Forest Service. And one of the things that I was focused on in preparing this special coronavirus edition was a question: why are the Forest Service's mission critical activities logging and fire suppression? Like, really, what's going on there? Besides like the kind of superficial stories we all know. And so I did a little bit more historic research, and I came upon something that I would invite any National Forest geek to read, which is the 1905 use book. The use book was written by Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief of the Forest Service, and other similarly minded men in 1905, and it established the foundational values of the Forest Service. And I want to read a couple of quotes out of the use book because I thought it was very instructive to why things are still the way they are. Forest reserves are for the purpose of preserving a perpetual supply of timber for home industries, preventing destruction of forest cover, which regulates the flows of streams for irrigation, and protecting local residents from unfair competition in the use of forest and range. So right there, you're laying out two of the main issues are permanent timber supply for home building, but also an immediate conflict with maintaining forest cover for water, for irrigation. And so that tension I thought was really interesting, that it was at the very, in the DNA of the Forest Service. The use book also says, in the management of each reserve, local questions will be decided on local grounds. The dominant industry will be considered first, but with as little restriction to minor industries as may be possible. Sudden changes in industrial conditions will be avoided by gradual adjustment after due notice. And where conflicting interests must be reconciled, I love this quote, the question will always be decided from the standpoint of the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. So there's a lot to unpack in that quote. First of all, I think that it shows the Forest Service's very dispersed line of control. Like, district rangers in the Forest Service actually have a significant amount of control. Each national forest is broken into districts. Each district has a ranger, and that ranger makes most of the decisions for their ranger district. So the use book sets out this dispersed control. Another thing that I thought was interesting was the quote, the dominant industry will be considered first. And if we went back to that first use, or the first purpose of the Forest Service, it's timber production for home building. But it also says, with as little restriction to minor industries as may be possible, recognizing the multiple use from the very beginning. And the piece about when conflicting interests must be reconciled, the question will always be decided from the standpoint of the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run, I believe is a very, very values-based decision. And so my first question, thinking through that, well, how is the greatest good determined? The greatest good for who, for how? So I looked further down in the use book to see if it could elucidate some of the values that the Forest Service was looking at to determine what the greatest good was. And it looks like the greatest good is driven primarily by values of, again, providing wood to home builders, stream flow for irrigation, range for the livestock industry, and stopping vast public and private losses through unnecessary forest fires. So for the past 115 years, those have been the Forest Service's dominant drivers in terms of management. So there's the use book. There's a little bit of information when the Forest Service comes and says timber production is mission critical, which we'll get to again at the end and talking about what's going on right now. Some of the reasons why it's so baked into the identity of the Forest Service. Fire suppression didn't come up in the use book that much, but for the values. And again, this was written in 1905. Now things started really changing for the Forest Service in 1910. And that's when the big burn happened. It burned 3 million acres in Idaho and Montana. Fun things are happening to the slides. And those big fires killed 86 people and were really, really scary to all the new settlers who were coming to the West from the East Coast. They had not grown up in a place that was adapted to fire or really understood that. Foresters also had not been working in the West. They were mostly from Washington, D.C., from the East Coast, from the deciduous forests and pine forests, and didn't understand the ecological role of fire. So the early Forest Service leaders, after they got all freaked out in 1910, basically argued that any and all fire in the woods was bad because it destroyed standing timber. This was actually contrary to some of the timber land managers out in the West, and absolutely contrary to indigenous people and ranchers out here, because all of them had observed that the indigenous process of lighting fires on a regular basis actually improved stand condition, improved livestock range. But the Forest Service in the 1920s put a hard stop on all burning, all light burning, all intentional prescribed burning, and all natural ignitions. They said, nope, no fire, it's out. And the 1920s is when the two main goals jumped. One was prevent fires from starting, which we've seen eventually in the person of Smokey the Bear, one of the most successful memes of all time. And number two, if a fire began, suppressing it as soon as possible. They had what was called the 10 a.m. policy, which meant that every single ignition should be suppressed by 10 a.m. the next morning. So I have had fire editions of this training where we go deeper into fire because it's fascinating. Suffice it to say, there's a lot there. I'm not going to necessarily go into it now. But for a long time, there was, especially after World War II, there was an escalated militarization of firefighting. And this coincided with a very cool, wet period. So the Forest Service was very successful in its initial attacks and suppression. And people got used to that. They got used to the idea that the fires could be put out, that the West didn't burn. This was a faulty assumption, not based on the vast history of large fires in the West. And as we're out of that cool Pacific decadal oscillation and into a warmer and drier time, especially combined with climate change, we're seeing that many fires cannot be and should not be put out with the initial suppression attack, but need to burn. However, even though the 10 a.m. policy was officially revoked 40 years ago, it has still influenced the Forest Service to this day. The Mount Hood National Forest still has a full suppression policy, and many of the approaches to fire suppression are still, out by 10 a.m. Or else the public and the ideas of liability are too strong. But I'm going into the fire rabbit hole. I shouldn't go there. I could talk the rest of this time about fire, but there's a lot of other things to talk about. So I wanted to give you a sense of history, a sense of context. Like, we're coming into this present moment of forest management with 150 years behind us, or more, of things moving the way they are to guide federal forest management. And there's a lot of inertia there. There's a lot of things that made sense at one point in this trajectory, at least made sense to the people in power. They're just completely different now. But that inertia built from that history is very important to know why things are the way they are now. So there's the history. I'll just say One other thing that I can't not mention is I've mentioned the BLM just gently in here because most of the land that the BARC looks at is the Forest Service. However, some of our land in that borders Mountain Hood National Forest is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And if you move south in Western Oregon, there is a lot of forest land that's managed by the BLM. It's the only place in the entire United States the Bureau of Land Management has an active timber program. And if you really like to geek out on fascinating federal land history, I would advocate that you look into the Oregon and California Lands Act and all the reasons why that land is managed by the BLM. The Oregon Wild website has a fantastic dive into the history of it. And for anybody, I saw Brodia from KS Wild was on here. For people who work down in Southern Oregon, that history it shapes things down there in a totally different way than we work with up here. But just a little side note for if you want to geek out on other federal forest history, Oregon and California Lands Act. All right, so I want to now move completely to another much more mundane slide and talk about the three branches of government. Or maybe actually I'll pause. You can look at this while we pause and we'll see if there's any questions in the chat. Refresh your memories about those three branches. All three of these branches are at play when we're talking about federal lands management. So the legislative branch makes the laws. And those laws are usually very broad, sweeping, visionary, not super specific laws. They lay out an idea of what should happen. Some of those laws are like the Endangered Species Act, the Wilderness Act. We'll talk more specifically about some of the nitty-gritty laws that really affect us later, but that's what the legislative branch does. And honestly, lately, except for tacking some riders on to other bills or sneaking some like bad bits of forestry stuff into the overarching farm bills, there haven't been, or actually protecting some places too. There was a victory last year for Oregon in protecting some wildlands, but there haven't been a lot of major substantive environmental laws coming out of Congress. And we don't anticipate there to, at least not under this administration. Hopefully that might change in the future. But so Congress is not as active now as a player, except for trying to keep those bad writers off the table. Where a lot of the action is, unfortunately, is in the executive branch. A lot of people think of the executive branch as just like the president and the cabinet. But the executive branch does all the regulatory work, does all the implementation. So this slide, it shows the independent government agencies, number 3 right there. That's the Forest Service. The responsibility, enforce the laws. That's implementation of all the regulations. So whereas Congress sets out these kind of broad, big picture ideas for how the law should go, it's in the regulations that are created by the agencies that the real teeth are. And so that's where a lot of action is happening, especially right now with the president asking agencies to review all the regulations and to rescind any regulations that are cumbersome. They're doing major rewrites of environmental regulations right now. And also the executive orders that have been coming out from the president also have been really affecting the way that the agencies go about their regulatory work. So sad, but a lot of what we do is happening in the executive branch. The heads of the agencies, I don't think I mentioned it before, the Forest Service, for some bizarre reason, is in the Department of Agriculture, not in Interior, where all of the other major land managing agencies are, like the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. The Forest Service is in the USDA, which is why the Farm Bill affects it, why our secretary is Sonny Perdue, who thankfully doesn't know much about forests and hasn't really been that involved in national forest policy, which is great. But that's the executive branch. And then the judicial branch also gets really involved because they're the ones who are interpreting these laws. And, you know, a lot of the time we try and avoid it, but we do end up in court. when the agency is not following its own regulations or the actual statutes. So all of the branches of government get engaged when we're figuring out what to do with federal land management. And in the judicial branch, I've got a real live example of the judicial branch in action later, so I'm going to save my judicial branch spiel till I get there. But I wanted to talk about, so we've got a history at play, we've got 3 different branches of government at play, and then we've also got economics. So these are all the things that are going on when you're like, why did the Forest Service do this, right? I'm trying to give us the big picture so we understand why they did what they're doing. Okay, now next slide, Courtney, we're going to talk about economics. So back to a map of Oregon, and so in this map, the yellow land is private property. If it's not yellow, it's public land, and most of it is managed by the federal government. Over 50% of Oregon is managed by the federal government. Down, do you see where down in Eugene and Medford, where it's just totally bonkers? That's the ONC lands that I was talking about, where every other square mile is private, federal, private, federal, private, federal. So I bring this slide up in talking about economics because, as all y'all Oregonians know, our state gets a large part of its revenue from property taxes. We don't have a sales tax. We have income tax and property tax. It can't tax the federal government. So that's half of the state that is in a non-taxable land base. Oh, the orange land, that's BLM land in southeast Oregon. A lot of BLM land in southeast Oregon. And the purple is mostly national forests. The orange is BLM, and then there's the craziness that's actually BLM in that checkerboard. So there's a problem there where the state's tax base and the federal land management don't meet up. So Oregon and the federal government worked on something that, and it's like this for a lot of national forests, even though Oregon has a much higher percentage of federally managed land than most states. Their solution was that counties would get 25% of the timber receipts generated within their county. So the counties had a vested interest in timber production. On the counties that have ONC lands, that number is 50%. So 50% of all of the timber receipts would go to the counties. And in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that was a lot of money they were getting from timber sales on federally managed land. But there was a big decrease in, oh, the white block around Crater Lake, that's a national park. Thanks for your question. Yeah, remember, if it's not yellow, it's not private, but there's a lot of different flavors of public land. So if you want to, Courtney, go to the next slide. It talks a little bit, I think talks a little bit about the timber industry. Honestly, I'm not remembering. Yes. So in 1990, this doesn't even get you in the heyday of logging. I've got it, my next slide, I think, shows how high it was for a while. But this shows how wood products manufacturing in Oregon has shifted. And I think one of the most interesting stats to me is if you look at 2008, 2009, when the recession hit, right? There you go. So the total harvest went down, down, down until then, but then started going up. But look at jobs, right? This is the other thing. So we've got timber receipts, then we've got jobs. And the jobs have gone down while the harvest has gone up. So I'm going to unpack both of those things now. First of all, the timber receipts. The counties just were freaking out as their as the amount of logging decreased over time. It really plummeted in 94. This doesn't show it quite as much. It didn't plummet in Oregon like it plummeted regionally. But so we started going down in 94 was when things started really decreasing. And the counties were like, hey, look, we need money. You're not logging as much. What are we going to do? They were pushing for logging and pushing for logging. Congress stepped in with something called the Secure Rural Schools and Community Self-Determination Act. And they basically said, we will subsidize you, counties. We will give you the amount of money that you were getting from your timber receipts, but you need to use that money to retool your economies so you're no longer dependent on logging old growth, because you can't log old growth anymore. Congress wasn't that clear, but that's what they were supposed to do. So for about the past 20 years, the counties in Oregon have been getting money through the Secure Rural Schools Act. It was just re-upped again last year, and for last year and this year. I won't go into it too much, but in very short, the counties have not retooled their economies. Mostly they say, we need to log more. We can't do it without timber, when almost all the old growth was already logged, and they just cannot log it twice. So Secure Rural Schools is helping for now, but there's this economic driver. The counties keep wanting to have more timber logged from federal lands so they can get the receipts. Now, the second one is just like the idea of timber as a driver in Oregon's economy. And as this slide shows, timber volume is increasing while jobs are decreasing. And the main reason that happened in 2008 and 2009 was because a lot of mills went out of business then. And one of the things that the successful ones did was retool to have more machines and fewer people, because people cost a lot more money than machines do. So we have almost a completely mechanized timber industry now. And almost all logging is done with machines, not guys with chainsaws. Are counties still getting a percentage of receipts? No, as long as Secure Rural Schools is there, they don't get the timber money. But if they lost that, they would get the timber money. But there's not as much timber money. So, but the counties still push for it. It's complicated. They still act as if they get it, but they don't. Unless they still get it on top of the Secure Rural Schools money, but I don't think so. But I'm doing what I said I wouldn't do and interrupting myself and answering questions. So I'm going to go back to the focus. We'll come back to the questions after. So where was I? I was in the timber economy. Right. Currently, the timber economy makes about 2% of Oregon's GDP. It has a hugely outsized political impact for how little of the economy it actually fills. I will note that in some places, like some communities, the timber industry is a much, much bigger factor than 2%, of course. But in the state overall, it's 2%. However, you can have a group like Timber Unity who has a hugely outsized impact on Oregon politics, even though the overall contribution to the state's economic well-being is low. But those are multiple pieces of the economic drivers that are also going into this. Right now, we see recreation. Well, right now, not so much. But the trend with recreation over time has been to bring more jobs into communities. I'll note that it's not like a one-for-one. You know, a logging job and like a service industry rec job are very different. And I think that we need to be mindful of that when we talk about rural economies. But there is a shift away from the extraction. Again, as I said, you can only log old growth once and most of it is gone. So the boom of logging that happened from the 50s to the 80s can never be replicated. But the counties often act like it can, and that the jobs will somehow be back at the level that they were before mechanization. But both of those things are over. The large trees are over, and the guy with a chainsaw in the woods is also over. And we're in a period of more small diameter mechanized logging, which will just never create the same economic boom to the counties. And yet it's still an issue in how federal forests are managed. So there have been a bunch of questions popping up, so I'm going to pause and go to the chat and try and answer them. State. Yes, with the state also is another issue. I've mostly been talking about federal forests, but the state is, if y'all are looking at the chat, that's what I'm answering. Question, are there any good examples of counties that did retool? Chris, that's a great question. Maybe Hood River County. I mean, I'm thinking Hood River and Clackamas are the ones that I know the best. And I think both of those have really reimagined themselves beyond timber. Of course, Hood River was amazingly positioned to do recreation and has done a lot of that. And Clackamas County has also really tried to increase its tourism. Estacada is just about to put in a cross-laminated timber plant, which I don't know that I would say is a good example of retooling, but some people might. The Southern Oregon counties, I think, are some of the ones that have the hardest time doing it. Douglas County in particular has been very intransigent about using their secure rural schools money to send themselves to DC to lobby for more timber on federal land. And they have been like specifically not admitting that they need to shift their economies. But I think up here, those are some of the best with Clackamas and Hood River counties. Oh, Gail asks, what about the recent lawsuit where counties will get money for loss of timber revenue? That was against the state. So I honestly haven't been following that quite as well. I know that the state is going to appeal that. But as I've said, this tie-in between counties and timber revenue is really tight, both on the state and on the federal lands. And the state doesn't have something like the Secure Rural Schools Act to bail the counties out. So they sued, they were awarded, I think, billions of dollars by a court that the state clearly doesn't have. So I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen with that. Here's a question. Please clarify the difference between state lands and federal lands. Maybe that did just clarify it. That the state got its lands, I'm trying to think, how did the state, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure why. I know why some lands are private and some lands are federal, but I am going to get back to y'all on how it was. I know some of the state lands used to be federal and the federal government transferred them to the state, like the Elliott State Forest was one of those. But I'm honestly not sure about all the other state forests, like the Tillamook Forest and the Coast Range. So maybe I can get back to that, or if somebody knows, feel free to put that in the chat. Only one other thing I guess I'll say, because it involves money, is another thing that's a big driver for agency budget or for land management is the agency budgets, which are set by the agencies themselves, executive branch, and by Congress, legislative branch. And currently we have, oh yay, we get to look at clear cuts. Clearly we have an administration that is putting an enormous amount of money into timber production for the agencies and not a lot of money into anything else. So even if an agency independently has a drive and a desire and a mandate to do things like watershed restoration or fish passage or road decommissioning or recreation, if the federal government does not allocate sufficient funds for it, then they can't do it. And that's one of the situations we're in right now, where I actually feel for the Forest Service because they simply do not have the money to do what they want to be doing. So that's just another bit of the drivers. So we now have the history, the politics, the economics. Now I'm going to get into the law and talk about a whole nother set of drivers for federal forest management. So some laws in the federal government apply to all federal lands. It doesn't matter if it's managed by the BLM or the Park Service or the Forest Service or Fish and Wildlife Service. Those are laws like the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. Those apply to all lands. Some laws depend on what designation the land has. So there's the ONC Lands Act, which is just for those Oregon and California lands. There's the National Forest Management Act for Forest Service managed lands. There's the Federal Management and Policy Act for BLM lands. There's Wild and Scenic Rivers, Wilderness Act. So one of the things you need to think about, if you find a piece of land and you're like, what's going on here? One of the most important things you need to figure out is who has jurisdiction over that land, right? So is it private, state, or federal? If it's federal, is it which land management agency manages it, and what suite of what suite of laws attaches to that management? And sometimes it can be confusing. We're luckily living in an era of better and better interactive maps, and so it can be easier and easier to find this information out, which is awesome. But that's a question that if you're really interested in getting into tracking projects and management, is under whose jurisdiction is this land, and then what laws guide that jurisdiction. So clearly I'm going to be focusing on the ones that really affect national forest management. So we're just going to leave this clear cut up for a while because I felt like it was a really good visual for the story I'm about to tell of the history of the more laws in the Forest Service. So we started, if you remember a little while back, we started with the use book in 1905. And for a long time, it was kind of a loose network of laws managing the land. But there was a lot of mismanagement, a lot of timber grabbing that was happening on Forest Service land. And in 1960, it's one of the first laws that people really point to as shifting just that free-for-all from national forests. And it was called the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act. Or I honestly see this acronym all the time. I don't know if it's MUSYA or MUSYA. It's MUSYA. I'll just say Multiple Use Act. In 1960, the Forest Service Congress passed that for the Forest Service, basically to put the brakes on full-scale logging as the primary purpose of the land. Now, you remember the use book actually set this up. It said that there are multiple purposes, and even multiple purposes that were in some kind of tension, like wood production, which have always been in tension in forest management. But the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act said, let me look at my notes so I get it right. It did two main things. It authorized and directed the Secretary of Agriculture to develop and administer renewable resources of range, water, recreation, and wildlife on the national forests for multiple use and sustained yield of the products and services. Now, this was the first law to have those 5 major uses of national forests contained in one law equally, with no use greater than any other. This was a shift from the use book, which remember talked about the dominant industry, which was timber production, wood production, to something where all 5 of those uses, I'll go over them again, timber, range, water, recreation, and wildlife, were all in that co-dominant position, which was a big change, and could have really sent the Forest Service in a totally different direction starting in 1960. But it didn't. Timber harvest still prevailed over the other uses. So in 1976, in an upsurge of environmental legislation, this is all following Earth Day in 1970, which I know a lot of us are more familiar now since we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. There was a huge social movement for environmental laws, and most of our fundamental environmental laws got passed in the mid-70s, including the National Forest Management Act. The main objectives of NIFMA were to require the Forest Service to develop plans for national forests, set standards for timber sales, create policies to regulate timber sales, and And the purposes of those objectives were to protect national forests from permanent damages from excessive logging and clear cutting. And if you'll go to the next slide, you'll kind of see what logging was like before NIFMA goes. Well, wait. The next slide shows how it ramped up from just post World War II to the 1970s. So NIFMA was the first time that the Forest Service really shifted towards landscape planning and planning for the future. So the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act said you have multiple uses that you need to take care of, but it didn't create a planning mechanism. It was NIFMA that created the planning mechanism and said, no, really, you need to have a plan, because what happened was that the push of the timber industry was so strong that those other four uses, except maybe grazing, because it also had its own industry backing it, weren't as strong. Courtney, can you go to the next slide? So there we go. So you can see, I wanted to just show how it ramped up from, only a little bit in 1905. It was really the post-war boom from 1945 to 1975-76 when NIFMA got passed, that there was this enormous escalation in logging. So, after the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, that graph just still keeps growing up. And it wasn't until it hit NIFMA that it started to tip down. It didn't stay down because the pressure of the timber industry is huge, but it did start to go down as the brakes were put on the industry, and the Forest Service said, actually, we don't get the pretty picture yet. Actually, we need to plan. We need to think through what we're doing and plan it. So the main things that NIFMA did was set land designations. Basically, every part of the forest is designated for some dominant use. And then it established standards to protect water, wildlife, soil, and it would direct how the projects were implemented and monitored. So I don't necessarily love Mount Hood National Forest's plan. It was written in 1990, so it's 30 years old and has not taken into account everything that's happened in the past 30 years, or many of the things. But what it did do was create a roadmap. And that was a huge change because there was actually something guiding how management would happen. And, while MUSA made it clear that there were non-timber related priorities, NIFMA actually embodied those in the forest planning process. And that is still what we rely on. And I want to, say, I said that the plan hasn't changed much since 1990, but if you look at this graph, you'll notice something extravagant happened in 1994, and that was the Northwest Forest Plan. And there's a long story with the Northwest Forest Plan, but the very short story is that in the late 80s, biologists started noticing that the spotted owl was becoming more and more scarce and started doing projections of habitat loss and owls and realizing that unless it was protected, it might go extinct. And the spotted owl loves to live in mature and late successional forests, which were the very thing that you see the escalation of that timber graph were rapidly disappearing. And so people petitioned for it to become listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Those petitions were granted. There was a big legal fight. There was an injunction on all logging in the range of the northern spotted owl before, until the agencies could figure something out that would ensure that all of the uses, water, wildlife, and in this case, water, wildlife, and timber being the main things that the Northwest Forest Plan looked at, all could happen. And there was a lot of work that went into it. And in 94, the Great Compromise was achieved that did change the whole nature of logging. However, that crash may have come without the Northwest Forest Plan altogether. People like to look at this graph and be like, the environmentalists and the owls, they're the thing that led to the crash. We'd be logging old growth forever if it wasn't for them. I'd like to think that it maybe ended the crazy growth a little bit sooner, but as we all know, most old growth trees, all old growth trees, like I said, you could only log once. And I say this a lot because I somehow feel like people don't remember that the industry would have crashed on its own without the Northwest Forest Plan. But it was a moment in time where the laws did change and things did catch up a little bit more. Of course, given the pressure from the timber industry, a lot of the protections of the Northwest Forest Plan have been slowly eroded over time, which is really disappointing. A lot of the reserves are now logged because all logging is restoration, and so you have to go in and log the reserve. But I digress. I wanted to let you know there's forest plans. They're a big deal. If you work on a national forest, your forest has a forest plan. If you work on a Salem BLM, or on a BLM district, there is a district plan. They are great to get to know. Ours is totally out of date. If you're interested in thinking through how to improve forest plans, BARC has an entire campaign about that. And at the end of this, I'd like Courtney to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing to bring our forest plan up to date, and particularly in terms of climate change and carbon storage. But they're an important thing to get to know more intimately than you ever thought you might want to, because they set the groundwork out for what the Forest Service can do. So those are some of the laws that are substantive. They say, do this here, don't do this here, depending on what time of land you're using. There's this whole other realm of laws, and I want the pretty picture when I talk about this other realm of laws. So I know I have a pretty picture there. It's the next slide, because you deserve that after getting all those graphs and clear cuts. The other type of law I want to talk about is procedural laws. Oh, we got it for like a second and then it's bad. Yes, there we go. So process laws are ones that don't say do this or do that, but rather say, if you're going to do something, then this is the process that you have to go through in order to do it. And those come up in a couple of different places. The Endangered Species Act has some procedural components where if the federal government wants to harm a threatened or endangered species, it can, as long as it consults with a federal agency before that happens. And the main one that we work with, there are some state variations in multiple states. Oregon doesn't have a state equivalent of it. It's called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And that law is one of the main things that gets the public in the door into impacting agency decisions. So, and our pretty picture went away again. It was there for a sec, but it's gone. So maybe you could try and get it back. It's way nicer than a timber graph. NEPA does two main things. The first thing it does is it forces disclosure of environmental impacts. So it tells the federal agencies, if you're going to do a major federal action that may significantly impact the environment, you have to study the impacts of it and disclose those impacts to the public. So that's the first main piece it does, is requiring the agency to consider and study the impacts of its actions, and then also to disclose those impacts to the public in some kind of accessible document. And that is one of the main things that BARC uses to get information from the Forest Service about what it's planning on doing. Now, the second piece of NEPA is that it says once you have done those things, or like once there's that disclosure, the public can comment and give information back to the agency, site-specific information that the agency may not have been tracking, may have overlooked. So it's a two-way exchange of information. And it's another one of those laws, like NIFMA. It was passed in the mid-70s as a way to increase government transparency, and also intentionally, not the regulations don't have this as much, but the statute said, what we're trying to do is encourage the agency to have more environmental considerations in its decision making. And so by incorporating this information into decision making, hopefully better decisions will come out at the end. That's what NEPA was intended to do. And sometimes that works. A lot of times it feels like the agency just thinks that it's some kind of hoops that it has to jump through in order to do what it was otherwise planning on doing. And that can be frustrating for members of the invested public, like all of you who are here right now are learning this because you're interested in affecting what happens on the on federal lands. And when they disregard that information, it can be kind of dispiriting. But that's one of the things that BARC does a lot, is we collect information, we read their documents as part of the NEPA process, we get our information from the field, from scientific reviews, from things like that, and then we send that information to the Forest Service also as part of the NEPA process. So I wanted to use a real life example of that because we just went through this in a big way with a project called the Crystal Clear Restoration Project. I think the use of the word restoration was interesting in this project. Insofar as the Forest Service is now branding all logging as restoration, it kind of makes sense. But other than that, it just seemed like a PR kind of thing, because the project itself proposed to log 12,000 acres, which was by far the largest project we've ever seen on Mount Hood. And this included about 3,000 acres of mature and old growth forest. It would also put in 29 miles of roads. The entire project was located in a land that had been designated as critical habitat for the northern spotted owl, which was supposed to be managed solely for the survival and recovery of the owl. The stated purpose of the project was to decrease the chances of uncharacteristic wildfire. This is what they said publicly, even though to do that, they were going to be logging trees like you see in this picture, which are high elevation, moist, mixed conifer mature forests. It was reducing the canopy cover to about 35% in most units, which is far below what is needed for spotted owls and spotted owl habitat. It also was done, this might not be my point, but it was done outside of the collaborative process. And I'm not a huge believer in the collaborative groups, but I am a member of the Wasco Forest Collaborative, which would have been the group that this project would have gone in front of had the Forest Service not skipped collaboration altogether. And so from the get-go, it was kind of teed up to be pretty controversial. Oh, I guess my last point was, yes, it's a moist mixed conifer forest for about half the project. It goes from west to east on the mountain, so it really moves from moist mixed conifer to dry mixed conifer. But it's the kind of area where in the moist mixed conifer, fire is naturally stand replacing, or at least mixed severity. So you don't really want to do a fuels reduction project in an ecosystem where fire is naturally mixed or high severity, because it will actually shift away from the historical conditions and fire regime. So just a lot of what they were saying in this project didn't match up. We went out there on the ground, they said it's dense, it's overstocked, and it looked like this in a lot of the places. There were several areas that had already been thinned and were large trees well far apart, that the only thing they were going to do was take just the remaining big trees, and they were positioning it all as restoration. And the main thing that caused such heartburn was that they analyzed this in an environmental assessment. And in NEPA, NEPA was created in the 70s thinking that most big projects would significantly impact the environment and be analyzed in something called an environmental impact statement and an EIS. And so the regulations are just chock-a-block full of what an EIS has to have in it. They're very detailed about public involvement, about doing economic analyses, what the environmental analyses need to look like, just pages and pages of regulations for what an EIS has to require. Now there's this one small section in the regulations that says, if you're not sure if the project is going to have a significant impact and therefore need an EIS, you can do a smaller document called an environmental assessment, which is a brief, concise document that summarizes the impacts, looks at alternatives, and gives you enough information to determine whether or not an EIS is necessary, right? It's just like it's in the definitions section of the NEPA regulations, right? It's not a big issue. However, over time, the federal government was like, that's our out. If we do EAs and say, nope, there doesn't need to be a significant impact, we don't need to do an EIS, we don't have to follow all of those regulations that are laid out in NEPA. We can just do these lesser, brief, concise documents, these EAs, and move forward a lot faster. And so that's what they've been doing over and over. When I started doing forest activism about 23 years ago now, gosh, everything was done in EISs. Timber sales on Mount Hood were analyzed in EISs. It was the standard practice for a timber sale to be analyzed in an EIS. The past 24 years, somehow those timber sales no longer significantly impact the environment, and now the Forest Service is analyzing them all in environmental assessments, which have a much, much lower standard of quality than EISs. And so here comes this huge project. It's it's been this shift, and to answer Brody asked, when has this shift been happening? It's been happening over time. I think the last EIS we saw for a timber sale was before 2000. So it's been about 20 years. No, wait, not 2000, sorry. I'm getting my decades messed up. About 2008, I think, is the last EIS we saw for a timber sale. And now we're shifting into the world of EAs, always and forever. Nothing ever significantly impacts the environment again. However, some things do, right? We're seeing this project, Crystal Clear, which is just 3 or 4 times as large as anything we've seen, logging more mature and old growth forests than we've seen logged on Mountain Hood National Forest for over a decade, all in spotted owl critical habitat with this very shaky fire rationale. And they're like, no significant impact. And from the very beginning of the NEPA process, Bark and several others in our comments said, whoa, wait, this one has a significant impact. This one, you're not going to get away with saying that it doesn't. Like, just fess up, acknowledge the significance of the impacts, and analyze it in an EIS. And then the next slide has more of the specific issues that we had concerns with. But the fundamental one is you cannot say, Forest Service, with a straight face, that this project is not going to significantly impact the environment. Part of its backstory being that none of the public documents said this, but we found out that the regional office told the Forest Service to produce double the volume of the entire national forest, is about 30 million board feet per year. They said, from Crystal Clear, you are going to produce 60 million board feet, and we're going to give you a loan to do it. And so they had this enormous volume target. But then they said, no, it's not about volume, it's about fire. Well, it's not located in any place that any plan prioritizes for fire. And their approach to it by logging mature overstory trees is highly scientifically controversial. There's so many papers that say when you take the large trees that are providing shade, that are keeping the fine fuels dry, that are stopping the wind, you actually might increase fire risk. We told this to the Forest Service again and again in NEPA comments, Remember, they tell us things, we tell them things, they tell us things, we tell them things. It's a bit of a dance in the NEPA process. And another issue that was really big is we said we need to shift into looking at carbon storage and climate impacts. And this would be a great opportunity for you to do so, Forest Service. Please do that. They just point blank refuse. They're like, no, that is not what we're doing here. We're just going to cut and paste a climate analysis from a totally different timber sale that has no application and not actually give that a strong look. So we sued them and we don't do it very often. But this was, they kind of, I almost feel bad saying this, but I feel like they set themselves up by skipping the collaborative process, by insisting on this huge project with this huge volume target in a place specifically designated for spotted owl protection, and using the very flimsy rationale of science while ignoring all the science that we had for them. This is an example of where the judicial branch really comes into play. And so BARC, along with Oregon Wild, Cascadia Wildlands, and Wild Earth Guardians, brought a lawsuit in the Oregon District Court. And the judge really seemed to understand our arguments, but then found for the Forest Service, because he said that within the context of this huge national forest, 1.5 million acres, a 12,000 acre timber sale, it's not so big, so never mind. It's actually not significant. You can just dilute the impacts by looking at the scope big enough. So we appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And just the judicial review is the entry level in federal courts is the district court. Many states have multiple districts because they have more population. Oregon just has one, given our population. And then the next step up are the circuits, and there's 11 circuits. We're in the 9th Circuit, along with Alaska, Hawaii, Oregon, California, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, I think, is us. And that circuit, as you can imagine, does more public lands law than any other ones, because there's more public lands in the West than any other part of the country. And so we were up there. The next level above is the Supreme Court. And so this has been going on. The entire NEPA process started in 2016. So it's been going on for 4 years. And sometimes these fights have a lot of different ups and downs and different threads, but the upside of this is that we won. Last month we got the opinion, and the court agreed that the NEPA analysis was insufficient because the agency had not actually looked at the science that is controversial, that says that logging large trees isn't going to help fire risk. In fact, it might make the fire worse. And so that was exciting. It was exciting as an organization and as BARC's members who do a lot of this work of getting the ground information, about getting the science information together, and then giving it to the Forest Service, and often having it ignored. It was really vindicating, I guess, to have a court, and the next slide shows a little bit about what the court said, understand that it's important to actually take the public's input in. And the court didn't just say, go back to the drawing board, Forest Service. The court said, go back and prepare an environmental impact statement. So we're now in the position of one of two things maybe happening. And I know I'm digressing a little bit, but this just happened and I haven't talked about it much. So I'm excited. And it's like NEPA in practice. The one of two things could happen. One thing, actually 3 things. One thing is the Forest Service could say, okay, we're going to go back to the drawing board and we're going to make that EIS. We want to go forward with this project. We think it's a good project. We understand that it needs more analysis. We'll look at the science this time. We'll do our EIS. Another thing is the Forest Service can say, we don't have the people or the budget to go back and do that EIS because they're really short-staffed right now. And given the pandemic, they're hurting, the agency is, and I feel for that. We might not, so they might just do the smaller parts of the sale, the less controversial parts of the sale, and drop the mature and old growth and the spotted owl habitat. I love that. I love that possibility. Another possibility is They are talking about petitioning the court to rehear the case because they so don't like the outcome. And they might do that. It's very infrequent that courts will rehear a case that another panel agreed to. And I don't personally think the law is on their side because the panel who decided our case followed existing law pretty well. And they would need to show some kind of clear error of judgment. But the timber industry in particular does not like this because they have been using the threat of fire to justify logging more and more over the past decade, and especially over the past few years. And they have been highly successful at garnering public support and public opinion around using logging being the main thing that we need to do to decrease the risk of fire. And it's simply not true. It is not scientifically backed up. So the decision of the court that the science that the Forest Service was relying on that said logging old growth, logging mature trees will help reduce fire risk, the court said there's no agreement here. What there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of controversy. And now we have this Ninth Circuit precedent that anybody else can point to and say, hey, agency, did you see this case? You have to take our science more seriously. You have to address the fact that logging might not be the only way to improve forest health or decrease risk. So I think that is a fantastic outcome because the Forest Service logging and wildfires is where I want to kind of go to end this, is talking about all of the way those things intersect back to the history and the now and the coronavirus, what we're looking at going into the future. So I've got a couple of slides. We're a couple slides behind now. The next one, you want to just pop there? There's just my we win. All right, here we are. Forest management in a pandemic. What is mission critical? And actually, I'm going to pause before that to look at the chat and see if there's any questions that I might have missed. Gail asked if there's only about 4% old growth left. There's slightly more on the federal lands. There's about 10% of old growth in the federal forest lands left. I think it's 4% overall in the state. But yeah, there's not much. And we certainly shouldn't get rid of any more of it than we can. And thanks, Berdia, for the oots. I feel very happy about winning that case still. All right, so we're in a pandemic, which is why I'm talking to you all on screens and why a lot of things are really different right now. The Forest Service is having a hard time thinking through what to do, but I wanted to focus on two aspects that they have been calling really, truly mission critical. And again, this harkens back to the beginning. What they said their initial purposes were for was timber production, and then also to prevent the unnecessary loss of timber to fire. And I was reading a little bit of the Forest Service has kind of a coronavirus frequently asked questions. So I was looking at that, and they actually used the words mission critical only to respond to wildfires. It's the only place in their entire frequently asked questions did those words pop up. And they say that their mission critical work, such as suppressing wildfires and other public service responsibilities, will continue within appropriate risk management strategies. So I think that this is a fascinating issue because if any of you were lucky enough to see the KS Wild webinar, they're doing a fantastic webinar series on fire and climate every week this month. The first one was on Tuesday night, and they had a speaker talk about how firefighting has been done and how the coronavirus makes it completely impossible to do firefighting the way it's been done in the past. And I'm not going to get into all of that, but I thought a few things were interesting as we think about Forest Service management going into this summer and fire season, because You know, it's the kind of thing, when I got involved in forest conservation, we didn't talk about fires at all. And now I swear I do like 80% of my work is talking about fires, even moist mixed conifer forests on the west side of Oregon. And so thinking about the fire response this year might be a big deal because, again, the timber industry is positioning itself as the hero. If we could log the forests, they wouldn't burn, is the message, and that message is getting traction. And so there's fear that because of the pandemic and the Forest Service isn't able to pull together fire crews from around the country, put lots and lots of people together in fire camps, and fight fires the way it has before, there's a fear that then if there are fires that get out of control, out of the Forest Service's control, then environmentalists are going to be blamed for the fires because we're the ones who kept the timber industry from cutting the forests down. And some people are really worried about this, really worried about this blame shifting. You know, we've seen the blame shifting happen a lot where the timber industry is able to position itself as the hero and the environmental movement as the villain, even when it's doing things like getting rid of jobs because of mechanization or losing jobs because of overharvesting, or as we're about to see with the pandemic, losing jobs because the timber market is going to change. It's important to note that one of the main things that's really going to be different is just the way that the Forest Service is able to fight fire, and just keep that in the back of your head when people are starting to blame environmentalists for this year's fire season. Some of those things were, there will be smaller, more local teams working rather than pulling people from all over, that there will be even more emphasis on early attack. So even though the National Cohesive Fire Strategy is starting to ask the Forest Service to kind of stand down a little bit and allow for some fire to burn naturally, because wildland fire use is one of the most cost-effective ways to do ecosystem restoration, there's a sense that that might not happen this year because people are afraid of a fire getting too big because they don't have the team. So there might be more initial suppression attacks than usual. And usually there's a lot, but it will like push back against that trend of wildland fire use. And also that if they do not have a reasonable expectation of success in protecting life or property, they might not commit a large team or resources. So I think the place that we really might see this play out is if there is a large fire that gets really big because of weather conditions. They might let it burn a little bit more because they simply acknowledge what most people in fire know, that if a fire is big enough and the weather is a certain way, there's really nothing you can do. And so why put people in harm's way trying to do that? So those are multiple things that we might see, but the Forest Service is making it very clear that now it is mission critical to them to do fire suppression. And if I had a lot longer to talk or more of a voice, I'm kind of getting to my edge of just talking. We could talk a lot more about how the Forest Service has really shifted to being the fire service in the last decade also. And the other thing that they are emphasizing will continue during the coronavirus is timber and vegetation management projects. The projects that will continue moving forward are things like field work focused on managing vegetation, which is another way of saying a timber sale, restoring ecosystems, which also means timber sale, reducing hazards and maintaining forest health, which also means timber sale. And they just use euphemistic words now. One reason why is that every national forest has timber volume targets that they are supposed to meet annually, and their performance evaluations are tied to those targets. So they need to keep churning out the sales, and they need to keep planning them and having the logging to meet their top-down timber targets. Those are the things that were deemed essential. Now, these are the the field work that's deemed non-essential, which is not happening under coronavirus, are field work like surveys, permit inspections, prescribed fire, scientific surveys, and forest health monitoring. Those are all put on hold during this time, which I thought was an interesting shift. I did want to say just one more thing about the economic impact on the timber industry. The Forest Service is going to keep planning timber sales because that's what it does. However, in prepping for this, I did a little bit of research about what the timber industry itself is expecting given the recession due to the coronavirus. And one of the things I found was that the US GDP is expected to decline 8% in 2020, and that housing starts are expected to fall off and get to about half of what they were at the beginning of 2020. It was about 1.5 million housing starts per year. And now they're looking at it being around 600,000 housing starts. And that is the main driver of timber sales and timber production is housing starts. And to compare that, in the 2008 recession, there were about 550 to 600,000 housing starts per year during that recession, which is equivalent to what they're expecting under the coronavirus recession. And that just tanked the timber markets. It shifted the whole nature, as I showed you, like the mechanization of the industry after the 2008 recession really changed everything. And so I think a lot of people are wondering if the Forest Service is still planning these timber sales, right? I'm circling us all the way right back to the use book. Remember what the number one purpose of the Forest Service was to produce timber for the housing industry. What if there is no need to have timber for the housing industry? What if the volume targets that drive the Forest Service are even more arbitrary in a world where there's no market for the logs, for the timber sales that it's planning? This may be what we're looking at. I don't think any of us know how long this recession is going to last, if this is a new normal, or if the economy is somehow going to right itself and people are going to start building at the same level as they were in 2019 or 2020. But I think there's an enormous amount of instability right now, which in some ways is a really good moment for us to bring in those questions again. Does it make sense to have the national forests' prime objective be to provide timber for a housing industry that does not need it? Or is it a moment where we can look back to that quote where what was the quote? If there are conflicting interests, they must be reconciled. The question will always be decided from the standpoint of the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. Now, what if that has changed in the past 115 years so that no longer housing or irrigation or grazing are the top primary objectives for the forest, but rather drinking water and carbon sequestration and wildlife habitat for rapidly becoming more and more threatened species? I think this is a moment where everyone is kind of pausing business as usual to think about what it would look like for the Forest Service to shift the values away from extraction dominance that has been guiding it for the past 115 years, and realizing the greatest good now is in maintaining those ecosystem functions, maintaining the carbon storage, maintaining the water resources on the land. And I want to leave this there and have some time for more questions and discussions outside the chat box. But I think we're in a really ripe moment to rethink what the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run will be in terms of federal forest management. So that's a lot of information. I'm going to take a breath. We can open it up to questions that you can say yourself or conversation. Also, Courtney, if you're interested in chiming in a bit about the Fremont Hood campaign or Brodia, you want to talk more about the forest, the fire and climate webinars that are going on. There's a lot of folk who are doing a lot of very cool things who are also on this call. And I want to shut up for a second and cede the floor and hope that one of you will say something so I can be quiet.
I can use my voice for a second. Thanks, Brenna. That was excellent. I really enjoyed every moment of it. And thank you for all the work you've been doing for so long for these beautiful places that we live and love. A little plug for the Fire Climate Summit. I think that's what I'm supposed to do. We are down in Southern Oregon, a place-based environmental conservation group similar to BARC that monitors timber sales. And we have a new climate program that we are launching. We'd been planning this summit for a while with a variety of partners, and we had hoped to have it in person, but have now shifted online. We had our first webinar yesterday and had some people talk about forest management under COVID, and Brenna has done a great job adding to that discussion as well. The video recording of that is on our Facebook Live. I'm still trying to figure out how to upload an hour video to my Squarespace account, so there's a little technical difficulty there, but if you want to check it out, it's there. And you'll also find there the next 3 webinars that are coming up. Next Tuesday, we'll have one on climate smart adaptation and look at an ecosystem assessment of Southern Oregon and what climate smart adaptation principles we can move forward. Again, in this pause of rethinking what land management looks like. And then after that, we teamed up with Lomakatsi Restoration Project, and they helped us put together a native panel that'll talk about cultural fire use and Aboriginal fire in the Klamath-Siskiyous. And then the last presentation will be the last week of May. And all this information is on our website. And that will be around defensible space and just practical things you can do around your home to be more fire safe. So thanks, BARC, for having this. This was really amazing, and everyone for attending. And if you want to know more, that's what we got going down in Southern Oregon.
Thanks, Brodia. And I see Courtney put in the chat the link to the Fire Climate Summit, so y'all can grab that. Before I was BARC staff attorney way back when, I worked for KS Wild as their staff attorney, and that's where I learned to love fire. And it's so great. If y'all haven't been down in that KS ecosystem before, it's a great, great place to see a landscape so shaped by fire and so fascinating and really mismanaged also. Yes. So love to KS Wild and the work that y'all are doing down there.
Thank you. Right back at you.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? This is open time.
You know, I had a question because I was following a couple of timber sales, and then all of a sudden in late winter, the market just fell because there was an oversupply and they couldn't even take the logs to mill them. You had to, you know, I don't know how that works out, but how can you follow that angle? I mean, how do you follow that news? I don't even know what references you would look that up on. Did that happen? Did I imagine it? No, I heard lots of people talking about it down here.
Yeah, the timber market's been really unstable. There was a softwood lumber treaty with Canada that, what's the word? I don't know, like we forgot to ratify it again, and things got really weird. And now with the pandemic, I'm not entirely sure how the timber industry tracks itself. I was just using my good old Google yesterday to look, and reading industry reports is really helpful. Another group that I love to read is the American Forest Resources Council, which is the timber industry lobby group based in Portland. And I learned so much by reading industry reports. And I would advise folk do that. I think sometimes we miss things because we're looking at our own screens. And then also the Oregon Department of Employment, Department of Labor, they have a lot of great stats. That's mostly on jobs in the timber industry, but they track the industry really closely and talk about jobs in the industry. So those are 3 things I do, just Google a bunch of words, read the industry notes and the Department of Labor.
Thanks.
Yeah, but the thing is, the Forest Service will just keep planning sales even if they go no bid. And that happens. They put enormous amounts of public resources into planning these sales because I have to. They're like mandated to, even if there's no market, which is a distressing waste of resources.
I can say one of the things we're seeing down in Southern Oregon is with the BLM, which is different under the Oregon-California Lands Act, but they're offering timber sales during this pandemic. They're going no bid, and they're just reassessing the numbers to lower the price to reoffer the bid. So they're just, if it doesn't sell,
just losing more money for the government.
I wrote my question out, but it might be too big to unpack right now. What would it actually take to move the Forest Service out from under the jurisdiction of the USDA? This allegiance insists that the Forest Service mission be based on capitalism and economic metrics, which will never value life.
That is a fantastic question. There's actually been a lot of people who have considered moving it out of USDA and into the Department of Interior. The last person to want that was I'm having a total brain fart, was the previous Secretary of the Interior, Trump's first Secretary of the Interior, the guy from Montana.
Zinke?
Yes, Zinke, Ryan Zinke. He is actually a proponent of that, of moving the Forest Service into Interior. Now it would still be in the federal government, so it would still be pushed by messed up capitalist politics, but it would be, I think, a lot more suited to there. That's where all the other land management agencies are. While we're at it, we could take the Bureau of Indian Affairs out of the Department of Interior, right? Put it with all the other health and human services. There's a lot of writing that should be done in the cabinet, and there are conversations that are happening, but the inertia of the federal government is vast. So I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. But it is absolutely a conversation that does happen at the federal levels, because it just doesn't meld well with the rest of the USDA. And it really sucks to have the Farm Bill get all these little like things about forestry in them that no one's paying attention to because they're all talking about egg subsidies. So it does make it a little bit more messy. Yeah, but I mean, of course, anti-capitalist revolution is what we really need. That would solve all of it.
I have to go feed my people. I don't want them to go to bed hungry. So
okay, bye.
Here,
bye, Gail. And anything else? All right, I see a question. Is the Northwest Forest Plan still the law of the land? I feel like the BLM has broken away from the plan. Yes. Yes and yes. For the Forest Service, the Northwest Forest Plan still is the law of the land. And yes, the BLM pulled a squirrely move, which is being litigated right now, and they pulled themselves out of it. And it was written very much with an all lands approach, like an ecosystem approach, which is why it was so different and innovative at the time. So for the BLM to have pulled himself out was very disconcerting. But for the Forest Services, there's 19 national forests, I believe, under the Northwest Forest Plan. And what it did was amend all of their forest plans. So until or unless they re-amend their forest plan, that's what is the governing regulation. So I think those are all the question. No, I've got another question. Going back up into the chats. Oh yeah. There was a question from Courtney to you all. She said, and you might have looked at it, you've just learned the history of why forests are managed the way they are now. What do you think today's priorities should be? So that's a question back at you for the last few minutes. Or if people are shy on Zoom, I can pass it over to Courtney to talk a little bit about the Free Mount Hood campaign and the work that BARC is doing to amend the Mount Hood Forest Plan, the very outdated Mount Hood Forest Plan.
Courtney's computer doesn't have a mic or a camera.
Oh.
She typed in a message. Hey folks, this is Nikisha. She typed a message in and I'll just read it just in case folks can't access their chat. So Courtney says, as Brenna explained, each national forest writes its own forest management plan. Our campaign is to tell them, show them, and give them relevant information and public input regarding the wildly overdue update and revision of the Mount Hood Forest Plan. So Free Mount Hood is the name of the campaign. Free Mount Hood is organizing conversations and advocacy that recognizes the need to change the way the forest is managed. So the campaign is calling on local communities, organizations, and decision makers, and the public to support and call for change. You've just learned a lot about the history of why forests are managed the way they are. Again, that question is, what do you think the priority should be?
That's great.
And hey folks, my name is Stacy. Courtney's giving me a little nudge. I'm on that campaign as well. And so, sorry, I have a dog that's kind of freaking out here. But so, like Courtney said, we're really looking at what kind of changes we can kind of start to push on within that forest management plan. And really looking at shifting the focus away from timber extraction and looking at sort of these bigger picture issues. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, but one thing we're really looking at is climate resilience. We're looking at the capacity for carbon sequestration within the forest. I'm going to quote Brenna. I don't think we've officially met, but I've been following some of your talks, and I know you mentioned that I think we're one of the top 10 carbon storing forests in the nation. So how can we look bigger picture at what some of our opportunities are to be a leader in terms of forest management policy, protecting water? We know, there's a lot of really big shifts happening in the hydrology cycle, again, to quote some things I've been learning from you, Brenna. So there's just a lot of opportunity within the forest to really be a leader in how we're managing and taking an approach to policy. And so one thing that I think is really like we're in agreement from what I understand is on changing the fire policies. Like there's more alignment there. And so that's kind of a way in that we can start to kind of hopefully work on some amendments to the plan initially, and then looking at some bigger changes as we go. So right now, I think we're just really kind of raising awareness. We've been on KBOO, we're at the farmers markets, or we were when we were doing those things. And so we can use all the help we can get to get the word out about trying to shift the needle on changing this plan that hasn't been updated in 30 years. Fourth Wednesday is our meetings.
Awesome. Thank you, Stacy. Thanks for sharing that. And I also wanted to say, if you're interested in other BARC things where you can look at people through screens and learn really cool stuff, we have our first ever virtual ecology club. It's going to be about lichens, and that's on May 14th from 6 to 8. And Mesa, our BARC lichenologist, is going to be talking more about lichens than you probably ever thought possible. And so you can join in on that. And we're still, figuring out how to transfer all of our things onto the Zoom. I know Courtney is going to be doing a comment writing training with several of our volunteers in June. And that will also be, that'll be up on our website and our Facebook. And we really miss being out in the forest with people. We encourage you to go into the forest on your own. Mountain Hood National Forest is now considering reopening some of its rec areas, but its trails are all open. And the state parks also just reopened yesterday. So if you haven't taken a walk recently, please do. It's really good for the spirit. And we look forward to being back in the forest with you soon. And I think that's what we've got for tonight. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining BARC's ever first virtual radical training, and for taking this information and using it however you do. Just informing yourself more about the law, history, politics, talking to other people, advocating for the places that you love. And please don't hesitate if you have any questions that come up to you later. I would say call me, but I don't have any access to my office phone. So email me, please, Brenna at bark-out.org, and we'll be in touch.